Hey everybody, it's Scott Leckie back from a little time away. It's Democracy Tomorrow again. Today's episode is with Nigel Denning, who's from the Integrative Psychology and Medicine entity in Melbourne, Australia, who's worked in the field of integrative psychology for many, many years, wears many different hats in that sector. And we're going to talk today because this is the World Citizen podcast at Democracy Tomorrow. We're going to speak about some of the psychological obstacles that keep more people from becoming world citizens, both in spirit and in reality, and how those obstacles can be overcome. In essence, how do we move from thinking about I, moving towards thinking about us, moving ultimately to our ultimate objective with global democracy, of course, which is all of us. So from I to us to all of us. We see a world of 8.2 billion people, each one of whom is consumed with their own reality, their own survival, their own perpetuation. We see many people reaching out beyond themselves to an us, but a very limited us, which tends to be, or can be anyway, nationalistic in orientation or very insular looking, neglecting the remainder of humanity. And our quest, of course, is to get more of us to be able to happily embrace the planet as a whole and humanity as a whole in our quest towards all of us, where we all live within the same political structure based upon our shared humanity and not based on the differences that divide us at the moment. So without any further ado, welcome, Nigel, to Democracy Tomorrow. It's great to have you here. So where do you see things standing these days in terms of our quest to get more people to embrace this idea of all of us? And where are the main obstacles, do you think? What is it that's holding people back that may be somewhat interested in the idea of a larger, political entity that covers the entire human race? And how do we overcome those obstacles?
Hmm. Well, for me, and the work I've been doing for the last 30 years, Scott, it's really about trying to understand how a mind works, how a mind evolves from a brain, because bouncing around in this bit of skull, our head, we've got about 300 million years of evolutionary history, and that's been largely oriented towards staying alive. Competing, staying alive, staying in 200 million years ago, we developed a sort of social grouping kind of feature of that brain. Again, these are incredibly powerful drives. And we've got a civilization that's been around for 15,000 years. So we've been trying to accomplish these incredibly defined tasks using an operational system that we really haven't spent enough time understanding and respecting. And so what ends up happening is, under stress, our brain simply devolves to what it's oriented to do, which is survive. And survival precludes the kind of group formation, the kind of socialization that we require to be able to hold a complex task like citizenship, because it means setting our personal needs aside in order to experience positively collective experiences. And that runs counter to the evolutionary constructs of our biology.
So many people would interpret that as meaning that once you have your own basic needs met, you must reach that level in order to go beyond a concern about yourself. So therefore, we need to rise everyone on the planet out of poverty, have no hunger, have no homelessness, have no, lack of income for anybody, and only then can we reach out and embrace all of humanity. Some would also argue that, however, on the opposite end, that it's not really about material uh, satisfaction, even at the basic level of minimum standards, but that it's just a sense of one's own sort of consciousness. So you can have sages, throughout the ages with no possessions and no money, and contemplating the nature of the universe and things like that, who absolutely have this awareness of all of humanity being one entity. So How do we square those two positions?
Well, I mean, the constructive quality of being able to kind of see interconnectedness has been part of the practice of, great meditative traditions. They've worked on capacities to develop an understanding of the brain, skills around navigating the mind in order to operate collectively without the need for kind of individual accumulation. So it's doable, but that's been done within a particular cultural context. And that cultural context is their cultural context. What we're really facing here is how do we understand all of these sort of skills that have been developed under different traditional cultural traditions and bring them to the table so that we can start to recognise that we are one species. Different cultures have emphasised different skills, different abilities, different realisations. We now need to start sharing that knowledge. We now need to start coming to the table and recognising that certain parts of our mind are developed by promoting certain activities. Certain parts of our mind are amplified when, as you say, when there's competition for resource. I mean, that's Maslow's hierarchy of need. I mean, you can't satisfy higher needs if base needs are not met. So, there is a need for some form of, redistribution of economic access across the world. That's obvious. But it doesn't mean that we need to be living in some kind of socialist utopia either. It's really a matter of kind of creating something that's based on people's capacity and ability to participate. um, is really where we start to move out of these kind of reactive patterns of brain. When we're under stress, we devolve into survival needs. The cortical system is a survival system, it's 300 million years old, and when we stress people out, that's where they go, by and
Right.
large.
And I think a lot of the reaction to the idea of world citizenship, or however you want to articulate the idea that all of humanity should have the same legal rights and the same ability to participate in a political structure and things like that, always comes down to fear. And fear in particular of losing what one has, and fear, as you just mentioned, of losing out in the battle for finite resources.
Yep.
So it's very easy for people at a theoretical level. It doesn't really play out this way, but at a theoretical level, one would imagine that people from the wealthiest countries who have the most needs met would be more likely to embrace the idea of world citizenship than people in countries who are the majority by far, where the percentage of the population in poverty is 30, 40, 50, 80%,
Yeah.
because they haven't yet met them. But in fact, my experience is in many of those poorer countries, they have a much higher percentage of people who are interested in the idea of world citizenship and becoming part of the entire thing than in the highly developed countries like Australia, where we live, and United States, Western Europe. It's still a relatively novel idea for most people in the highly developed world that um, that world citizenship is even on the table at all. You know, so how do we get past that idea of which is the one I encounter very often is I have to give up so much if I'm to embrace the idea of world citizenship that I don't want to do it.
Hmm. Part of it is kind of understanding what fear really is. I mean, we're born fearful. We're born hyper aroused. Fear is our survival drive. We're born hyper aroused, and then through the course of life, we're either given tools to down regulate that or we're not. And what tends to happen is people associate survival, they associate success, they associate identity with possession, with achievement, with power, with control, with accumulation. And when people are locked into that, we end up with the kind of society we have at the moment where the Australian Bureau of Statistics published some data last year. 1 in 2 adults in their lifetime in Australia are now going to get a mental health diagnosis. At any given time, there's about 25% of the population seeking treatment for some kind of psychological distress. 30% of the adult population will receive an anxiety diagnosis, 15% depression diagnosis. So what we've got is a society that's driving these kind of fear-based orientations to find solution in acquisition and accumulation. We recognize it's not working culturally, but because we're not thinking about how our brains work, thinking about how our mind emerges from our brain, what we get caught in is all the kind of messaging around need and want and possession. And remembering, like it's only what it's the 19th century. The levels of poverty across the board were similar to the third world in the first world. So this whole sharing of wealth and sharing of the economy is a relatively recent phenomenon in the last century or so.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. But even though there's so much material abundance in the world now compared to any previous period of human history, by far, life expectancy is higher than ever before. Disease eradication continues. Economic growth is at levels in many places where it's never been higher. The list goes on and on and on. Material comforts are readily available to a very large percentage of the human race. Still not nearly enough, obviously, but we have made progress. In other words, we've made
Yeah,
very, very substantial material progress that cannot be denied by anyone. I mean, China alone has risen something like 300 or 400 million people out of poverty in just the last 20 years. I mean, this is an extraordinary development. Think what you may about China, there is no denying that they have done that. And this is something that's, extraordinary. But we also, at the same time, have a trend which is noticeable within seconds of turning on any mass media station now of greater nationalism, greater autocracy, authoritarianism, inward looking, nationalistic, rah rah, wave the flag sort of behavior, that this is somehow going to cure all that ails us.
yeah.
And this is exactly what is, was intended to be kept at bay by the international order that was designed at the end of World War II. It was designed to ensure that everybody everywhere got human rights for the first time in human history. Individuals were not even subjects of international law until 1945. It was entirely state versus state. And suddenly individuals entered the picture and they all got rights
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. But the world we've built over those 80 years is in many respects sort of unraveling to the point where we have, you know, more nationalism than we've had since the Second World War right now.
Yeah.
And nationalism is the anathema to the idea of world citizenship if there ever was one. So how do we specifically, what can we do at national levels to reduce the scale of growing nationalism?
But a lot of our historical kind of learnings about participating in society come from the ancient world, and they were very, very big, not just on rights, but on obligations. What we haven't done since the Second World War is talked about what would be required from each of us to participate adequately in the world that we've created in a way that's sustainable. It requires that we not just apply our thinking to our rights and therefore accumulate those and create fear about them being taken away and having to be having daddy protect us from someone taking our rights from us. We have to think also as a mature species about what obligations we have. What I need to hold within myself, what responsibilities I need to take in order to be able to participate. A friend of mine did a lot of keynote speaking into China around this kind of fear-based approach to education because they were understanding that because of the exceptionalism that they were driving their students with, that it was creating rigidity because the motivation of a lot of their students was fear-based, not wanting to be shamed, not wanting to fail. And so they weren't able to amplify innovation and flexibility in their thinking. And so they started to realise that there's something going on at the level of the human brain. We work really well as a species when we're dominated more by um, dopamine and um, serotonin, where we're actually moving into organisation in our prefrontal brain, our human brain, rather than these reactive, responsive, fear-based conditions. And it's only in the last 20 odd years that we've started to understand how we need to organise the brain, what features we need to kind of organise to help a mind stabilise itself, how we can extinguish fear, how we can extinguish anxiety and depression, how we can process intergenerational trauma, which is something that drives so much of this fear-based behaviour. It's what's happened forever in our family histories. So we've only started to come to terms with all of this in the last quarter century. We now know what's required to optimise a brain. We know what's required to optimise a mind, but that would take a huge cultural effort to shift our orientation, to actually start thinking about responsibility, to start thinking about our own personal obligations in order to participate in the world. It means that I can't accumulate, a million times more than someone down the road, and not that to have negative consequences.
Right. We always say that, everybody, every single human alive has within them the kernel that is needed to build upon in order to reach this understanding of world citizenship. It exists within every single human. There's not a human alive that does not have that within them. It's part of being human. So, how do we speak to those who have yet to discover that kernel within them that is there, but they don't even realize it yet? What can we say to them concretely that would get them beyond a sort of nationalistic embrace of whatever country they live in, that they can love their own country, as many people are kind of forced to do, but you can also love humanity even more.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's like having a bad experience with your parents growing up, isn't it? Like lots of people, grow into adulthood with conflict and difficulty with their parents, but often, you can also still see the value in having those parents and the opportunities that they've afforded. So it's really about starting to kind of understand more systematically what the values are, what values are required to be a citizenship, to be a citizen in the world. I mean, the ancient world did this really well. They had all sorts of theories of the Stoicism and Epicureanism. They had all sorts, and then that's really what kind of embedded Christianity in our value system was the kind of the experiences of the Knights Templar and the Ten Commandments and these value systems that they imparted into society. That's missing at the moment. We're in a grab bag of acquisition, but no one is really talking about what's required to be citizens on this planet in order to husband this planet, to support the ecology of the planet, to provide for us ongoingly for the next how many thousand years. At the moment, we're not viewing it that way. We're seeing this in a very, very reductive materialist kind of perspective, where we're seeing this as an infinite resource, and we can keep pulling from it as much as we want, whenever we want, and it's just an absence of any kind of sense of reflective obligation and responsibility taking, and that requires stabilisation of the fear centre of the brain. That requires a view of the world that is more collaborative, more collective. We're all capable of it. I mean, I've done a lot of this work. One of the areas I've worked in for years is in male family violence. And it's remarkable once you get perpetrators in a situation where they're no longer fearful and reactive, they start becoming collaborative. You have to overt it. You have to give them the tools. You have to show them that they're better off behaving that way and thinking that way. But as soon as there's a bit of positive reinforcement, it changes. I've done that with survivors of institutional abuse. I've done this with all sorts of groups. Just teaching people how to regulate themselves. I do this in training in groups of multiple professionals where often they'll become hierarchical. It's the psychiatrists and the doctors and the psychologists and the social workers who find a sort of a hierarchical resting place. When you frame up collaboration as something that is in their interests, because being in part of a team in mutual interests improves their own interests. You start overting that really, really clearly, and people go, oh, okay, yeah, of course. But there's no will at the moment politically to really teach these values and these skills.
I mean, at the political level, the very nature of the democratic political system that we have created over time leads a certain psychological group to seek dominance within those political structures. The political structure, I mean, the obvious example is, Mr. Orange over in the United States. The ultimate narcissist of all narcissists has benefited by knowing how to manipulate the system that is going to bubble the narcissist to the top. The same thing applies. I saw a great analysis the other day. The three of the most powerful countries in the world have this. Each one represents one angle of the pyramid, the triad of evil, or whatever they were calling it. And one was you saw that? Like, one was Machiavellian, which was China. One was, well, basically evil, I guess, Russia. And then there was narcissism, which was the United States. And, so I wonder if there's any, techniques you can recommend politically that would, instead of favoring those with psychopathologies, instead facilitate the emergence of, very selfless, very compassionate, very solidarity driven leaders that would institute policies that were not designed to enrich themselves or to promote the eternal greatness of their countries, but rather the preservation of the single planet on which we all depend in a system where all of us participate.
And part of the issue is really coming to terms with the way our minds work. And the most powerful and organizing feature of our mind is what we would describe as a symbolic register. This is when we move from being animals into being humans. So it starts to form up at about 2 years of age. But it's an incredibly powerful organizing principle. So, we'll we use this feature of mind to link things to make sense, to down-regulate fear in order for us to kind of optimize. So when you create fear in a population, when you stimulate a population to be fearful and angry, and then you've got them primed to believe that God is coming to rescue them, that there's a kind of a whole fantasy out there, it becomes really simple then to put an autocratic figure into that symbolic register, because what it does is it goes into this really primitive part of the brain which says, I'm scared, but if I've got a strong dad, I'm going to be okay. In the schoolyard, my dad will get your dad, and I'm going to be better off because my dad's tougher than your dad. And it's literally that level of organisation that this sort of autocracy is operating at. And it was really interesting, wasn't it? There's a publication where 28 professionals put their career on the line to outline the character of Trump, to demonstrate that he was psychologically unfit for the role. But because we've spent so much of the time, and remembering, like psychology only took over from religion as a kind of as a social process back in the 80s. It hasn't been around very long. What psychology's done over the last 40 years of trying to find legitimacy is focus on pathologizing people. It hasn't focused on helping us understand what a healthy mind needs to look like. And so when we enter into the kind of the pathologies of Trump, no one's really switched on. No one's listening. No one's listening to the kind of retrograde nature of this autocracy, because it can't lead anywhere positive. It can only lead into conflict because it's so primitive and symbolic. It's creating anger and control as a cure for our fear and confusion. And it's no surprise that in countries where autocracy is on the rise, that populations are losing their standard of living. They're becoming fearful. They can't afford a house. They can't afford to educate the children the way they were. They can't go on holidays or they can't afford adequate health cover. And all of a sudden, in that fear and in that chaos and that confusion and the idea that the people don't have the capacity to have leverage in society, they then offset that to the strong leader who's going to protect us. Yeah, correct. Yeah, I mean, you saw the rise in, that's exactly what happened in, the lost generation after the First World War and before the Second. It was lost middle class people. It was scared and confused workers wanting relevance again that led to the rise of fascism in Italy, in Spain, in Germany. It's fear based. And we now, and we haven't had this in human history before, we have enough knowledge of how a brain works, how a mind emerges from a brain, to be able to explain this process in detail. It's now just a matter of educating people, helping people understand that we can learn to regulate our mind. Like, we've got half the population don't understand that they can learn how to regulate anxiety or depression, that they go to medication instead. So we're feeding into our society a kind of a sense that we're all a little bit powerless.
Right. And when you feel that way, you figure, well, let's give them a try. Right? Democracy didn't work for me, so I'm going to instead kill the whole system and put all power in the hands of one man without reading history or neglecting what you learned when you were a kid and not realizing that what you're voting for is an inevitable dead end.
Because the view I have of the world is one of fear.
And then you have enough fear, it always morphs into violence in some form or another, and then, and that's part of the reason that we set up this channel is that, there are these theories about history going in, 80-year cycles and things like that. And we are exactly on the 80th year right now from the end of the Second World War. And you can see it all around you that there is a, I mean, we did a lot of work on the UN Charter and kind of, announcing and celebrating its 80th anniversary just a couple months ago. You almost heard nothing about it. And this is the most important law in the world by far in terms of holding the world together as it is. And everybody's now chipping at the edges as if it's kind of a game, I mean, even this morning, Trump said, about a, contemporary example. No country since the end of the Second World War has given recognition of territory acquired by force. It's this ultra fundamental principle of international law. You cannot invade another country and get away with it. Essentially, it is totally prohibited under the UN Charter and many other standards. Trump said now, let them have, yeah, well, that's right, let them have Crimea and, other part, and absolutely not join NATO, and then maybe there'll be a peace agreement. And he's completely contrary to the basic principles of the international order, which was largely driven by the United States, by the way. And creating, when, if that's accepted, then the Pandora's box just flings open, the genie is out of the bottle, and before you know it, China's invading Taiwan. Certain territories are going to try to take back territories that were taken in the 1930s, and the list goes on. And then you have a global conflagration, which is everything that the UN Charter was designed to prevent. But it all comes down to 8.2 billion minds, really. At the end of the day, it's 8.2 billion minds build the world that we have. And I think you and I would both agree that the capacity, the collective capacity of our minds as of today is infinitely lower than it could possibly be, you know? So how do we make that? I mean, I also think we both totally agree that it's only a matter of time before we do eventually collectively evolve into the next stage of our shared evolution. which is a continuum which is ongoing at all times, but we're still very much in a sort of interim period, right? Where we have like nobody really knows what to do or how to do it. So how do we peacefully, casually facilitate the and expedite, our emergence into a more evolved state, just as we have millions of times before as the same species.
Well, as you said, Scott, I mean, we've never had the knowledge that we have today about the way the human brain works, about how it's evolved, and how the mind works. It's only 1985 that we named PTSD as a condition. Up until then, we'd handled all of these kind of people coming back from wars, and we kind of pretended they were heroes. And in many cases, they were. I don't mean to be disrespectful of their service, but what we didn't do is work with the trauma that they experienced. We forgot about it. I had a job years ago. I worked at a rehabilitation hospital where all these elderly First World War veterans were dying, and they were reliving life in the trenches 60 years later because nothing had been reframed. We need to understand how our minds work and how they've been marked. All of us have trauma, and a lot of political decision making is driven from either a combination of greed and acquisition or fear and distress. My great 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 grandparents have been tortured by your great great grandparents. I feel the cumulative problems of that. It distresses me. I'm going to solve that by bombing you, and it's going to make me feel better. Like it's this kind of irrational, illogical madness that comes from not understanding the symbolic nature of the mind, the way in which symbolic representation is so important. That's why daddy's so important. That's why, we create nationalism as a way to gain amplification of people's loyalty to each other against an other. So it's all orientation of fear into aggression. So we understand this of the way the mind works. We understand this as a natural feature of the brain. We understand that we've only been doing this civilization gig for 15,000 years on top of a 300 million year old piece of wetware. So understanding that, having a bit of compassion for ourselves, but also starting to have really, really clear rules and and understandings and conditions about what it is to be a citizen, what it is to participate, that it's in no one's interest to go and invade someone else's property other than my personal interest. I can enrich myself, and that's because we're not understanding what human beings are capable of, what our minds are capable of. We kind of see it in these kind of moments where we respond to stress, we respond to a disaster, and we pull together and everyone's sandbagging, for the flood, or they're helping with the fire, or they rebuild after a disaster. There are all these incredible collaborative features of our species that we don't value. And we only really experience them when we're under existential threat. So what we get in this kind of process of building authoritarianism is the reality that this is an ultimate existential threat. And if we don't wake up from it, because it's a delusion, it's created by symbolic organisation of our fear, of our flight and fight responses, of our trauma responses. It's a way to artificially think we're gaining control over our bodies by getting control over other people and other worlds. We start to understand that. We educate people about that, and we give them the skills, because we now do have capacity to give people skills around processing trauma, self-regulation. And as people start to learn this, they automatically go into an understanding of themselves as part of community, as part of ecology. Uh, and there are numerous different interventions that I've been involved in that can create these experiences.
Well, we sure need a lot more of them because I mean the scale of which dehumanization of the other is now being employed by governments around the world is staggering. I mean, and it's so successful in a horrible, evil manner. that it is allowed to continue on. And and that's why, to me and so many countless others, and I'm sure the idea that all humans are the same, which is so inherent, I think, in the belief structures deep down inside all of us. That's that kernel that we all have. It needs to come out more, and we need to transcend any effort to dehumanize. The Russian families that are dying are suffering the same exact thing, even though they're more responsible for it because they did the invasion, than as the Ukrainian families and every single other example in the world that exists today. It's the same thing. And all you do is perpetuate it by pushing forward. And we need to really get away from this dehumanization, because it's just tragic to see that we have fallen for this trap again.
Because we still allow bullies to dominate. I mean, it's as simple as that, like it's not that complex. So it's, the last day of Ceausescu, the Romanian fascist dictator, he organised a huge demonstration in Budapest where he could come out and he could talk about the work he was doing to bring the Soviet the dream to life, and people have been buying it for 20 years. He'd really been able to impose this view on them of the struggling proletariat. But on that day, something happened in the crowd, and they just went, "We're not buying this anymore." And it was because someone else, a collaborative, a community-based religious leader, had been threatened, and his community came out in support of him. It rippled through the entire country, and it led to his downfall within a few days. So it's an extraordinary shift in the way that the mind works from being in this place of obfuscation, manipulated by power and control. Because this is what we're allowing at the moment. We're allowing people, and you see this in America, that the kind of, the way in which legislation is increasingly oriented towards the wealthy and against the citizens. As soon as you allow those kind of, that to enter that slide, you're promoting really, really primitive drives in the powerful, and you're disempowering the many. We need to recognise that. We need to recognise that that kind of fear-based stimulation is will always lead to destruction.
Yeah, but in the meantime, the psychopathic leaders get the poor and oppressed to vote for them. And that's the shocking thing of all. I mean, the manipulation of people is staggering. I mean, if you just look at this so-called big beautiful bill that they passed in the United States, it completely decimates the poor and lowest, 40% income earners. And yet they, by and large, back it because it was backed by the, you know, great leader. And that happens over and over again in countries, right? They know exactly how to do it.
Totally. One of my areas of specialisation is working in cults and cult extraction, and I've worked in that extends out into abusers within the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, other formal organisations, and unfortunately, what's been known for a very long time by people who are motivated to manipulate other people is how to do it. The problem is that the good people who are going along and just wanting to, have a good world, have a good life, do the right thing, they don't actually see often that people can be that focused and manipulative. And so, and I could give you the playbook in how to set up cults. We know how to do it, and the American Republican Party in particular have become exceptionally good at creating the fear, creating the enemy, creating the solution. Classic cult induction. Yeah,
Well, there's basically a handbook for it now. I mean, a handbook, how to become a successful dictator. It's been, used time and time again. We need the opposite. We need something. We need to create a handbook for how do we create global democracy, and how do we create, a world of equal humans that realize consciously on a daily basis that they are all dependent on the very same planet, and that only if we manage it properly can all of us live to our true potential and ensure that we have humans on this planet for millennia to come.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's setting up the conditions not to manipulate people, but to empower people. So everything that we understand about cult control provides everything we need to understand about creating freedom and equity for humans. But it links back to that point of people needing to be motivated to take personal responsibility.
Absolutely. And as you know, as we have seen throughout history, every dictatorship fails. Same with cults. Sooner or later, every cult fails.
All fail. All of these structures fail, but they fail in spectacular ways.
Spectacular ways with much carnage along the way. It can take, generations to overcome again. Yeah. So let's end today now on the most positive note you can think of in terms of giving people some ideas or hope that we're actually a lot closer to achieving this objective of global democracy and world citizenship than many people may think.
Yeah, well, we know how a brain works. We know how a mind emerges from a brain. We know how to help people to process trauma. As we start to understand these features, we know how things have been used negatively. What we need to do now is starting to think positively about a roadmap for citizenship. What's required for us to be healthy participants in this world? And we know that. We know what it is. We just need to kind of put it into political play.
Right. Right. Well, with that, let me thank you, Nigel. Hope you'll come back very soon to Democracy Tomorrow. Um, Everybody who's watching, if you have any ideas for future episodes or themes you'd like us to cover, guests you'd like us to have, we've set up a whole line of 10 or 12 guests coming in the next few weeks. Please let us know. Please give your comments. And, think about it yourself. Where is your kernel within you that exists, guiding you to eventually embracing world citizenship? And how can you get there? If you like what we do, please subscribe and like our channel. Please tell your friends. We are the World Citizen YouTube channel, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode. Thanks for watching, everybody, and thanks again, Nigel. We'll see you soon.